you're the guest of honor. You get to pick your seat.
Hey, Nico.
So finally, hey, Felix. So finally, we have a Berlin original in the house. I asked before in the introduction, for hands up of people that are actually from Berlin. It weren't that many. You were actually born here, raised here, pre-wall, I assume, even though you look
pre-war,
young and
not
sharp.
Pre-war, yeah. Born and raised in Berlin. Yeah, and basically spent my professional career here as well, building stuff, and always been a big believer in Berlin, trying to give, but also Berlin has given a lot of things to me. So it's my city.
And before we speak maybe a little bit about that past, you have a new role. And you've really seen all sides. You've founded startups, you've sold startups, you then integrated those companies into existing corporates. You worked in venture capital in Lisbon for Faber Ventures. And now you're managing director and VP of Samsung Next here in Europe.
Yeah.
So some would maybe argue you went from the VC, the dark side, to an even darker side. But Forbes recently said that Samsung Next is a little bit like the Navy SEALs of Samsung. I mean, that sounds pretty kick-ass.
Yeah, well, I have to say, I haven't heard that before, but it's actually an analogy I like. I mean, Samsung is obviously a really big company. I think with over 300,000 employees, I don't know the exact number. And so what we're doing with Samsung Next is probably comparable to this. We're a very swift arm, basically. We're working with startups, with software and service startups to help Samsung to interact with that and basically try to source innovation into Samsung. We do that by investing, by acquiring startups, and also we have a partnership group, for example, that can help facilitate startups to partner and do commercial licensing partnerships with Samsung.
And before we talk a little bit more about sort of corporate innovation and these different methodologies that exist for corporates to tap into sort of the startup ecosystem, I want to talk about a little bit the early days here in Berlin when you started Places. What year? I mean, that's
2007.
2007, right?
Yeah. Well, actually earlier. We started 2004. We sold the company in 2008, I think.
So way before, I guess, the time that most of the folks in this room moved to Berlin. Tell us a little bit about the scrappy old days, and I don't mean the dark cellar parties in Mitte, but more like building a company in those days.
Yeah,
without accelerators,
sure,
without incubators,
sure.
without any of that. Right?
Yeah, without TechCrunch, without all these VC blogs that tell you about how to build a company and what a term sheet looks like. Well, I mean, I think it was it's always hard to post-rationalize these things. I think a lot of it comes down to timing and to luck to a certain extent, right? So when we started Places, it was a good time in the sense that the first wave of the first bubble had burst, right? So people could build cool stuff sort of in the shadows, right? There wasn't too much venture capital flowing in, and there was a small but very active scene that evolved around what became later known as Web 2.0. So sort of making the web a two-way street again. It was a bit of a paradigm shift. And at the time we felt like, okay, we have to be part of this. We looked at services like Flickr or Delicious, and it's like we got to build something like this. And well, I mean, we didn't know that there was. We didn't know what venture capital was, to be honest. I mean, I heard the term, but we started Places as a project. I think that was, in hindsight, very healthy because, it was basically just bootstrapped. We had our day jobs. We built it. It was a project. And then there were a couple of people in Berlin that, ended up going to us and saying, like, look, guys, I mean, why don't you turn this into a company? And say, well, I don't know how to. Because I don't have money for it. And they're like, wow, but there's this thing called angel money or venture capital. You should really look at that. And then once I understood the concept, I'm like, wow, that's almost too good to be true. People giving you money to build something, and all they want is equity in return. They don't have to go to the bank. And then we kind of figured these things out for ourselves. We got really lucky because the early users we had were fairly prominent angels from Silicon Valley, which we didn't know they were prominent. It was like the founder of Wikipedia and the current head of MIT, and Mark Andreessen became an angel. And of course, those guys then kind of told us how it works and became our investors and educated us. And I think through that, we also brought some of this knowledge into Berlin and some of the capital into Berlin. Yeah.
And another company, by the way, also one of the angel investors was Christoph Meyer, correct?
Yeah, of course.
And you're going to be on a panel with him, a VC panel tomorrow. The godfather of the Berlin startup scene, Christoph
Yeah, well,
Meyer.
he was very instrumental in helping us to turn this into a company, for sure.
And then you built another company in Berlin called Amon. And that was almost, in that way, like in the sense of the hype and the buzz that Berlin had in those days, almost a counterpiece to that, right? It was a very, I would say, much talked about startup. Ashton Kutcher famously invested, Index invested. And then you kind of decided to let it go, even though as an, I guess, external user, it looked like a really buzzing community. And that question, that I have about this is actually a question that I think a lot of entrepreneurs ask themselves on a day-to-day basis, which is, when do you stop iterating? When do you stop looking maybe to even pivot your product and just let go, sell, or close shop?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the toughest questions. Thanks for asking. And you're right. I mean, when you do a startup, if it goes, if it's a rocket ship, it's a rocket ship, right? You don't have to think about it. Of course, you keep going, right? If you launch and it just makes poof, also you kind of know, okay, we got to give this a new try. We got to go back to the drawing board, or even with your early users, if there's no traction at all. But then you have this really large gray area where I think actually most startups are in, right? And some people tell you never give up, be really resilient, just keep pounding your head against the wall, and others say, fail fast. So, I mean, what we did at Amon is, because we knew it was going to be very hard to build a, consumer, mobile-first, social network, pure, free acquisition, basically, because we didn't have a business model I mean, we did have a business model, but we didn't have it implemented in the original project. We knew this was going to be extremely hard, and actually it hadn't been done. I mean, the kind of company I just described hasn't succeeded out of Europe. And except for Instagram, I can't think of one that has succeeded in the US, mobile-only acquisition and mobile-first social network. So we knew that we had to have phenomenal traction really, really quickly. So this is something I recommend to every entrepreneur, whether it's a B2C product you're building or a B2B product you're building. Before you start, sit down and look yourself in the eye and make a pact where you think you need to stand after a year. Yeah. Because otherwise, it's very easy to talk yourself into, hey, it's not going that bad, and use anecdotal evidence, and interpret data in a way where it's not so terrible. We're getting there, and the next feature will fix it. I mean,
trend line is positive.
Yeah, I mean, if I had $1 for every time I heard something like, oh, once we roll out the group feature, things are going to be like, and I mean, you only have so many companies in you, right? So I mean,
you had a clear number. Like a user number?
Yes,
or
we had a clear user number. I mean,
monthly active.
Yeah, we say if after a year we don't have 10 million monthly actives, we're going to shut it down. Yeah. And before that, even in the closed beta, we said, hey, we can't lie to ourselves. Like, if you give it to the 4 of us, the first prototype, and we don't use it day and night, then we don't have something. Because it's a very addictive, supposedly addictive product, right?
It was.
And then we gave it to 100 people and said, okay, if the numbers don't show that 100 people use this day and night, we're not going to give it to more people. And so everything went well, to 10,000 people, and we hit the numbers we wanted, and we had a closed beta with 10,000 people, and then we open it up. But still, we couldn't get there. I mean, it's like Formula One, right? You get around the first corner perfect, the second, and then when you have just a small problem in the third corner, you can't win the race anymore. So it's, but this is not necessarily true for everything. I mean, the numbers vary obviously, but it's very important that you set your own goals before. And then my personal opinion, this is just my opinion, I think it's better to say, hey, let's maybe stop this here and take a fresh cap table and give the money back to the investors, take a half a year off, and then do another company. Because you only have so many in you, and I see a lot of people pursuing things for too long, and it's emotionally extremely taxing to do a company as an entrepreneur. And to have these board meetings where you don't really hit the numbers, and you're like, oh shit, what am I going to tell them? And it's better, I think, to make a cut and then say, hey, I have maybe this 3-4 attempts in me in my life. Yeah. Let's save this energy and these emotions.
It's a great tip. So coming back to Samsung Next now, with corporates, we see this also at TOA, obviously with a lot of the corporates that we work together with. There's so many options of what to do, right? Build an accelerator, build an incubator, build an entrepreneurship program, build a venture lab, build a VC fund, or give money to a VC fund, or have a VC as a service fund, manage your VC fund. I mean, it's almost endless possibilities. In your career, you've worked with lots of corporates, and now seeing what Samsung Next is building. Like, what do you think is a good approach for modern day corporate, or is there even one?
Well, I mean, I think we're in the early days of this, right? I mean, you have to understand. I mean, you have to think this whole startup culture. It's 10 years old, and now more established industries are being digitized, and the ways of working and ways of Silicon Valley in a way have sort of perpetuated the whole world, and now corporates are experimenting with a lot of different models, and you mentioned some of them. I think that, and we've done the same thing, right? So I think with Samsung Next, right now we're at a stage where we want to offer a whole toolkit to a startup. So if we encounter you, if you want to interact with Samsung, we want to interact with you. We find the right thing to work with you, right? I mean, one of the criticisms against corporate venture is, why don't you just acquire the startups, right? I think Fred Wilson has said this pretty famously, like, why do you play in our turf? Why don't you just acquire?
Yeah. He even said, like, he doesn't want to invest into companies where corporate VCs invest,
well,
maybe for strategic reasons.
I think he's corrected that in the meantime.
Okay.
and I don't think it's true, to be honest. And he has co-invested with corporate VCs. I think, we can act as a straightforward investor. We have a 150 million fund that we can invest out of, and we don't require any side terms, any right of first refusals. We can act as a total plain vanilla investor if that's what the right thing is to work together with you, with your startup. We can also acquire you, and we've done big acquisitions into Samsung, like Smart Things or Wiv, which found its way into Bixby, our AI assistant. So we've done impactful things that found its way right back into the Samsung ecosystem. And in a lot of times, a straightforward acquisition is the right thing to do. We also, like I said, we have a partnership team that can help our portfolio companies to open the door for Samsung. We wouldn't promise that. We're not misleading startups in the sense that we're saying, hey, if we invest in you, you're on the next telephone and you get free distribution. Of course, this is a different discussion, but we can open doors, and we have dedicated liaison in Korea and a next office there. So I think a lot of these things have worked. Some work in certain cases, others work in others, and we'll try to have that whole tool set available.
And speaking of acquisitions, you recently acquired a company in Greece, right?
Yeah. I guess that has come out. It's when you
Thanks for confirming the leak.
Yeah, well, it's been on TechCrunch yesterday, so I mean,
then it must be true.
Well, no. Well, no. I mean, I think by now it's official. It's a text-to-speech company we did acquire in Greece. It's just when you want to stretch the Navy SEAL analogy, then maybe this was more of a covered operation. But yeah, I mean, this is a good example where with the text-to-speech company we'll hope to extend our capabilities.
By the way, to the audience, because Felix is really a wealth of knowledge, so. Do use Slido for questions, and we're gonna, 5 minutes to the end of the talk, we're gonna open this up since there's a lot of value also in the audience. Let's speak about Europe. You've been in Berlin, you then moved to Lisbon. Looking at the German scene, like the recent graph showed that the market cap of Apple, Google, Facebook, and Amazon is larger than the combined DAX 30. Which combines companies like Bayer, VW, SAP, Siemens, Allianz, Deutsche Bank, etc., 24 other global brands. Why have we not been able to produce an internet juggernaut here in Europe to date?
Well, I think in the last 10 years, or since the web, of course, a lot has changed in the world, and there's been very transformative companies, with the smartphone, with the browser, basically, really touching every single person on Earth, right? So changing how we live. 10 years ago, nobody was walking through, nobody was walking through the city like this. Now everybody walks through the city like this. And so if you create a company that fundamentally changes the way how people interact with the world, of course it becomes a very, very valuable company, right? And those are these companies that you mentioned. I think that now we are entering, and this was a bit I would say the digital low-hanging fruits, right? And American companies had an incredible unfair advantage. They already had the culture it took to make these companies really big, really fast. You already had Silicon Valley. In the PC era, everything was in place. Venture capital was there, risk-taking attitude was there, being an entrepreneur was cool, was there. All this stuff we didn't have.
Why do you think that is? Is that even sort of an after effect of the 60s, California? I mean, why in California?
I don't know. It just started a lot earlier, right? Like whatever the reason was that it started in the 50s or 60s, when Netscape came out, they were ready, or Netscape actually came from there. And then, I don't think we were ready in Europe. And then also, of course, it's a huge domestic market. So, and if you have a product like Facebook or so that's pure digital acquisition, you can get to critical mass insanely fast, and then you're there to stay, right? And now I think we're going to see in Europe, or out of Europe, or worldwide, we're going to see a new wave of companies with existing industries being digitized, whether it's automotive, manufacturing, luxury, tourism, all this stuff. So the things we learned in the pure digital are now being applied to sort of more messy real world things. And I think that Europe, with these industries that I just mentioned, we're in an insanely good position. We now understand how the game is played, and even corporates become very agile and start experimenting. I mean, if you look what Daimler's doing, I mean, I was at Nokia when it got disrupted by Apple, right? And a lot of times that's an analogy that's being used, like, Tesla is going to be to Daimler what Apple was to Nokia. I don't think it's that easy. I think we're in a very good position if you think about Germany in terms of manufacturing and automotive, France, luxury, Spain, travel. Let's see, I've heard from a couple of companies, and of course this is anecdotal, that I talked to recently in the US that were in the more sort of B2B manufacturing automation space, that they were like, look, we're going to move to Germany because this is where the customers sit that are our first customers that actually can apply this and understand this. Manufacturing in the US is basically stuck in the 60s. It's probably not universally true, but I think that the cards are definitely being reshuffled, and I think that we're sort of entering sort of a golden decade or a golden age for Europe in a way. And that's why we're also where we're starting here now. Samsung Next is it was clear we had to come to Europe.
And European VCs are often said to be sort of less risk-taking, right? And then European VCs sort of counteract to the American VCs and say, you guys are inflating a bubble. Is the truth somewhere in between?
Well, I'm always an extremely optimistic person, right? So I don't think that it's a bad thing to take big risk and to go for high impact. Because like I said, if the outcome is that everybody in the world, changes the way they interact with each other or with the world, then that can't be overestimated. I remember these. I mean, of course, it depends. When you pick the wrong company, people are like, "Oh, you were crazy. You've inflated everything." But then, if you pick the right company, I remember, I don't know what it was like when Microsoft came into Facebook at what at the time was a crazy valuation. People were like, "That's just insane." In hindsight, it was the best deal ever. It was cheap. It really depends. But we will see similarly transformative companies continue to see those in the future, and we are on an exponential growth curve regarding the whole world, right? So if we see similarly transformative companies in other spaces like automotive or I don't know, flying personal vessels or whatever, these things will be so largely transformative that you can't bet big enough on them, really.
And how
So I'm
important,
more on the American side there.
and
to
how
be honest.
important are ecosystems, and can they be manufactured or engineered? I mean, all the cities in Europe, you know, have regional programs running now. Governments across the continent are trying to emulate what has actually happened very organically in Berlin, right? And you've seen it now also picking up in Lisbon.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, I think every city is a bit different. So this, like, you know, living in Lisbon, it was annoying to hear all the time that it's the new Berlin. When you go to Warsaw, people tell you it's the new Berlin and everybody's the new Silicon Valley. I mean, those analogies really don't help. There's a unique situation in every ecosystem where it comes from and, you know, what it brings to the table. The smaller European countries, they are more globally thinking. Other bigger European countries like France or Germany have the advantage of a larger domestic market. You know, less regulation, more regulation. It's very different in many ways. What's important is that the mindset of entrepreneurship and the tools and, you know, how this game is played and you know what an MVP is, and, you know, that you iterate fast and all these things, they've become common knowledge, and that's what's really cool. And what's really changed also in a lot of European countries recently, and, you know, that's part of the reason why France is picking up so fast now, is that all of a sudden the best people are not going, you know, into consulting and that's or you know, a big large corporate,
banks,
but
yeah.
at least try once in their life to build their own company, whether it's early in life or a little later in life, doesn't matter. But I think it's become a way of working, and that's universal, and I really like that. And I think that now in Europe, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not if one ecosystem gains, another loses, right? Like right now we see the whole tide rise and basically lifting all ecosystems in Europe and across the world, frankly. It's wherever you go these days. And I think it's incredibly great, and it's just accelerating humanity even faster.
Maybe 2 technology questions. I have probably 20 on here, but we're running out of time. So a quick fire round of blockchain, cryptocurrency. Berlin is, you know, becoming more and more a center for this technology. Are you bullish on it? Midterm, long-term, short-term?
Everything.
All bullish, all in.
All bullish. No, I mean, I think it's incredibly fascinating, and I think it has the potential to be transformative. I mean, you have to look at it at sort of blockchain. You have to look at it like a protocol, you know, like HTTP at the time when it was developed. We can't even imagine yet, you know, some of these applications that we see right now are still very literate, you know, very sort of, you know, obvious, and we haven't seen native blockchain stuff coming out. It's always, you know, the horseless carriage phenomenon. Once you have a really transformative technology, people build the obvious stuff, but they're basically just recreating what was there in a more efficient way. Like, oh, we have a banking app, let's do that we have interbank transfer, let's do that on blockchain. Okay, that's obvious, but I think we're going to see truly transformative things, like with Web 2.0. Only then you saw this stuff that was really native to the internet, and that was, you know, using this medium in a way it was meant to be, and this is part of why I'm so bullish on Europe. I think Berlin has a great history of you know, cybersecurity, hacktivism, hacker culture with the CCC. You know, a lot of people forget that before there was shoes and e-commerce, you know, there was this culture. And I think now, you know, with the founder of Thor moving here and with Ethereum from here, I think we're becoming a bit of this center again. But all of Europe, I think, I mean, this is why we're at Samsung, we're really interested at it. Of course, it has the potential to break up this currently very monopolized internet in terms of data, in terms of identity, and move all this stuff back more to the edges and decentralize everything again. I mean, that's for me is incredibly fascinating. I have to say, when I did Amon, I was very frustrated with, you know, one company controlling distribution for my company and not being able to control my own destiny. If anything that sort of makes that more decentralized again, I'm all for it.
Yeah, and we have lots of it going on today and tomorrow. Largest ICO founder of Tezos is here, Gavin Woods, co-founder of Ethereum. So let's take some audience questions maybe. Do we have some questions? I believe so, right? Are you going to read them? I'm going to read them. Do you want to pick one? Let's see.
What kind of startups is Samsung Next interested in working with? That's a great question.
Yeah, that must be a team question. Come on. No, we don't do that.
No, I mean, what are we looking for? Basically, software and service companies that can help us grow Samsung more into the direction of becoming also a software and service company. Companies from that have the potential to be transformative for existing products or be the base for entirely new products, for entirely new business lines. Investing we do typically from really early stage all the way to Series B. And yeah, so you know, if you fall in that category, we're happy to interact.
Another one, don't you think that Samsung joined the VC space quite late? I mean, guess maybe to make this a little bit broader, this question, you know, like for corporates or Mittelstandscompanies, German Mittelstandscompanies, you know, some may really think like we missed it totally. It's too late to also build, you know, the 10th accelerator in my industry. What do you think?
Well, I mean, you know, like I said, it's in the future, the world is getting a lot more complex in terms of, you know, what it takes to build something. You know, if you look at autonomous cars or cars in general, it's already much more complicated. You know, you need to understand manufacturing, value chains, all this stuff. It's not in the future. The transformative companies won't be built with like three people building an MVP. You know, with 20K in a room. That might still happen, but that won't be the norm, right? So, and Samsung is spending 40 million a day on R&D, and apparently we've done something right. I mean, we're one of the most profitable companies in the world, and apparently, you know, doing the business we're doing right now. Right? Doesn't mean you can't learn, and it doesn't mean you cannot transform and soak up this culture. And I don't think that we're late. I think we're just getting started. I mean, in the grand course of things, the last 10 years have been experimentation, and now we're seeing it's like the second industrial revolution. I think now we're seeing the real transformation, and you know, we're basically on the forefront of it. So far from late, really.
Great. That's it for us. Thank you very much, Felix. Thanks for joining, and see you tomorrow for the VC panel.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.